I had been standing at the edge of the reception for 40 minutes before she found me. Not because I enjoyed receptions, I don't, and I never have, but because leaving early from a diplomatic transit station's formal mixer is the kind of thing that gets noted in your file, and I had 2 more weeks of consultancy work on Velkern before my contract ended, and I could go home to my greenhouse and my soil samples and my particular, quiet life. So I stood. I held a glass of something pale and mildly citric that the station dispensed in quantities calibrated to keep the attendees present without making any of them interesting, and I watched the room the way I watch a field I've been asked to assess, not for what it was advertising, but for what it was actually doing. The reception hall at Velkern Frontier Diplomatic Transit Station was a long room with high observation windows along the outer wall. Through them, if you stood at the right angle, you could see the transit lanes, 7 colored marker strings of light at varying distances, ships moving along them like slow, deliberate thoughts, and beyond those the 3-moon rise that happened here every 19 days, and that the station's brochure had apparently decided was the facility's primary attraction. The inner wall was paneled in something dark that absorbed sound without returning it, which meant the hum of perhaps 80 people from 12 species produced a noise that felt muffled and specific, like a thing wrapped carefully in cloth. There were food stations at both ends, a bar in the middle, and along the observation windows a scattering of tall tables at which people had arranged themselves in the configurations that species-mixed receptions always produce. The ones who came to actually talk to each other, the ones who came to be seen talking to each other, and the ones, like me, who came because leaving early gets noted. I had been on the station for 6 weeks, long enough to know the corridor rhythms, the commissary's morning peak, which ventilation unit on the 3rd floor made a sound like consideration before shutting off, long enough for the agricultural liaison, Oren Kell, to recognize me by gait from the other end of a corridor. The work was the southern continent's mineral profile. The Velsing grain importers wanted to know whether the southern continent could support a secondary cultivation site, and the soil there was unusual. A high silicate base with lateral mineral stratification from the gravitational stress of 3 moons at close orbital distances, and the standard models previous assessors had applied had returned inconclusive or negative recommendations. I had been contracted to start from the beginning. What I had found was that the soil was not defective. It was different. Most assessors before me had tried to correct the mineral profile to match what they knew. I had been working with what was actually there. She had been in the periphery of my week. That was the most accurate way I could put it. I'd seen her 3 times in the main corridor, once in the commissary, once in the lift that served the lower administration offices. Each time she'd been moving with a purpose that didn't leave room for stopping, carrying a document case or a handheld or nothing visible at all, her face composed in the way that people compose their faces when they are managing a great deal that no one around them can see. I had not spoken to her. You don't, on a transit station. Everyone is passing through. Everyone has somewhere they're going and something they need to accomplish before they get there. And the corridor is not the place for conversation, unless the conversation is about the corridor. She was Velon, I was fairly certain, the teal-green skin, the silver eyes, the particular quality of stillness that the Velon carried in their bone structure even when the rest of them was not still. Tall, dark hair pinned in the practical style that people use when they've been working for 11 days straight, and the pins are doing the last of the maintenance a more careful arrangement would have been doing at the beginning. She was wearing the kind of clothing that made itself invisible, a deep gray that was neither civilian nor formal, neither too plain to attend a diplomatic reception nor too marked to blend with the non-diplomatic attendees. The document case was gone. She was holding nothing. She was standing about 8 inches to my left, looking at the room. She said, quietly enough that I almost missed it under the wrapped cloth hum of 80 people, "You don't know me." "No," I said. "I've seen you in the corridor this week. You work in agricultural systems." Soil assessment mostly, tail marrow. A pause. She was not looking at me. She was looking at a specific point across the room, and the look was the kind of look I associate with people reading a field for what it was actually doing underneath what it appeared to be doing. I have that look myself, probably. It comes from years of the work. Tail marrow, I need to ask you something. All right. Another pause. Longer. Whatever she was looking at across the room had not changed, but her assessment of it had deepened in some way I could read in the set of her shoulders. They had the quality of something bearing weight that was not going to get lighter by being acknowledged, and that was not going to be set down until the situation permitted it, and that the bearer had long since stopped registering as weight because it had been there long enough to feel like the natural condition of things. I knew that quality. I had grown up watching it in my mother, who ran a settlement's water allocation for 16 years and who had, on the day she retired, sat down at the kitchen table and cried without explanation for 40 minutes while I stood in the doorway not knowing what to do or say. I had not recognized the quality in her until that day, when it was finally absent, and the absence was enormous. I recognized it faster now. I need to ask you to be my husband, she said. For the next 40 minutes. Only for tonight and only for 40 minutes, and I will explain everything after if you want me to, but I need an answer now and I need it to be yes or no. I took a moment, not because I was alarmed, but because the request warranted a moment, and because a moment was what I had. I looked at the room the same way she was looking at it. I found the point she was reading. A Velon male, older, on the far side of the bar, with a handheld tilted at an angle that was not the angle of someone consulting it, but of someone using it as a cover for something else. His gaze moved across the room in a pattern that had nothing to do with social ease and everything to do with method. He was cataloging. He was doing it with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom this was a task he'd performed many times, which meant the pattern was practiced and would be difficult to distinguish from ordinary social survey unless you were looking for it specifically. I looked at her. She was not panicked. That was the first thing, and it mattered. Panic makes people rigid in a specific way. The shoulders rise, the jaw tightens, the breath comes in at the wrong intervals, and the eyes do too much. She was none of those things. She was tired, the deep and particular tiredness of sustained, invisible management. And she was reading a difficult room accurately. And she had made a calculation that had led her to 8 inches to my left. And she was waiting for me to tell her whether the calculation was correct. The calculation was good. I could see that from where I was standing. I was the right kind of person for what she needed, long enough on the station to be recognizable, not long enough to be categorized by anyone's factional analysis as having specific affiliations. Present but not performing presence. Standing at a window alone, which is the behavior of someone who is here because they are here, not because they are managing an outcome. And I thought this without vanity, the kind of person who could do a thing without making it into more than it was. Yes, I said. A breath went out of her. Not a theatrical breath, not relief performing itself for an audience. The breath of someone who had been holding something very specific and could now set it down briefly in a place where it would be held by someone else while she attended to the next part. Thank you, she said. What do you need me to do? Nothing complicated. She shifted, very slightly, so that we were no longer side by side at the window, but at a slight angle to each other that suggested, to anyone reading us from across the room, a conversation rather than 2 separate people coincidentally occupying the same space. Stand beside me. Talk to me as though we know each other. If anyone approaches us, let me do the speaking. If anyone asks you directly your work, your time on the station, anything factual, answer honestly. I only need to not be cataloged as unaccompanied. Understood. The man at the bar is going to sweep the room at least twice more before the log closes. The first sweep he's confirming. The second he's verifying. We have approximately 38 minutes. What happens at 40? The log closes. After that, it doesn't matter what I am. She glanced at me then, for the first time properly, and the silver eyes were the color of a soil sample from a high silicate deposit. Not cold, exactly, but measured and precise in reading what was actually there rather than what they'd expected to find. You agreed without asking why. You needed someone to agree, I said. That seemed like reason enough. A pause. She was not accustomed to that, I thought, to someone agreeing without requiring the reason first. I did not expect that, she said. I didn't have an answer to it that wouldn't make the moment into more than it was, so I didn't offer one. I shifted my glass to my left hand so that my right was free, and I turned us together to face the observation windows and the 3 moons, which were now arranged with the 2 smaller ones at the same height and the largest slightly above, like something deciding whether to be formal about it. Tell me about the moons, she said. I looked at her. I need us to be having a conversation, she said, and you know about terrain. Tell me about the moons. The large one is Velkern primary, I said, about 60% larger than standard for this stellar mass. The 2 smaller ones are captured. They were independent bodies at some point, running their own orbits, and the primary pulled them in over a long period. The station's brochure calls the alignment a wonder. Geologically, it's more interesting than that. The tidal stress on the planet's crust from 3 bodies at those distances produces a mineral stratification in the southern continent that's unlike anything else in this sector. High silicate layering with lateral bands of compressed ferrous compounds at irregular depths. That's what I've been here to assess. Is that why you're here, the stratification? Partly. The Velsine importers want to know if the southern continent can support secondary cultivation. Most assessors recommended against it. They found the mineral profile complicated and treated the complication as a defect. And you? I found the mineral profile complicated and treated the complication as the actual soil. I held my glass and watched the primary moon shift slightly as the station's orbit adjusted its angle. Most of the interesting things in systems work are in the complication. The complication is where the soil is being honest about what it is. She absorbed this. I could feel her attention, the portion of it that wasn't reading the room, which was most of it now, on the thing I'd said. Across the room, the man at the bar had moved 3 steps to his left without appearing to move with intention, which is a specific skill and not a common one. I watch it happen in the way I watch anything I need to know about without drawing attention to the knowing. He's at the start of his first sweep, she said quietly without moving her head. Don't look at him directly. I'm not. He'll take about 4 minutes. He's methodical. 4 minutes of conversation at a reception window is 4 minutes of ordinary behavior. I looked at the moons and thought of something to say. The southeastern quadrant of the southern continent, I said, has a subsurface layer at about 9 meters that I think could support a modified grain variety the Velsine haven't tried. The lateral ferrous bands act as a natural mineral supplement if you plant with the banding rather than across it. No one has tried that because the standard cultivation grid runs perpendicular. It's a small change. The yield profile the test results suggested today was not small. She was quiet for a moment. You came here expecting one thing and found another. I came here expecting the previous assessors were probably right, I said. I find it's better to assume the previous work is probably correct and then find out whether it is. Turns out it was asking the wrong question. What was the right question? Not can this soil be made to grow what we want, but what does this soil actually want to grow? I felt rather than saw something shift in her. A small shift, like the adjustment the station's orbit made to the angle of the moons. Something that had been held in a fixed position for 11 days encountering a piece of information it hadn't been carrying. He's past us, I said. I know, She breathed a controlled breath, measured and deliberate. 17 minutes to his second sweep. We're on schedule. We stood for a moment without talking. The reception moved around us in its various configurations, its various purposes and negotiations and social accountings. The attendant with the drinks tray made another circuit. I held my glass without drinking from it and watched Oren Kell across the room shift his handheld to his other hand and say something to the Velsine importers that made them exchange a look of the specific kind. That means the number being discussed has surprised at least one of them. "May I ask your name?" I said. "Sareth," she said. She didn't offer more than that, and I didn't ask for it. Names are a form of offering, and she had given me the one she was willing to give, which was more than I needed for what we were doing. "How long have you been on Velkern, Sareth?" 11 days. "Since you arrived?" "Yes, it was supposed to be 4. Events made it 11. "Events in the work." "Events in the nature of the work," she said carefully. "Which is that it tends to require longer than the initial estimate, because the initial estimate is made with incomplete information, and complete information usually makes everything more complicated. That's also true of soil assessment." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but occupied some of the same territory. "I imagine it is," she said. "You come in expecting one thing and find 3 others. The complication is usually where the actual substance is. The work my predecessors found inconclusive was probably better characterized as preliminary. They found the complication, assessed it as a defect, and stopped. I started from the complication." She looked at the moons. I looked at the moons. The primary was now clearly above the smaller 2, a resolved arrangement, the alignment settling into its peak configuration. "I have been starting from the complication," she said, quietly, more to the window than to me, "for 11 days, and there was a great deal of complication, and I have been starting from it alone, which is the nature of this particular kind of work. The kind where the work is invisible, and the weight of it is invisible, and the person carrying it is required to appear in every room as though the weight is simply absent." She stopped. Her shoulders had something in them that I recognized as the moment just before a person acknowledges that what they've been carrying is heavy. Not the acknowledgement itself, not yet, but the moment before it. "It is tiring," I said. "Extraordinarily," she said. We let that sit between us without filling it. There are things that can be responded to and things that are better received plainly, without elaboration or management, because elaboration moves them from the register of acknowledgement into the register of being processed, and some things want only to be acknowledged. The weight she was describing wanted only to be acknowledged. I acknowledged it the way I acknowledge a soil result that tells me something significant, by being with it fully and not immediately reaching for what to do with it. "He's starting his second sweep," Sareth said. Her voice had not changed. Whatever the acknowledgement had cost her, she had not let it cost the work. I felt the shift in the room's geometry again, the way a surveying presence moves differently from a social one, just slightly, just enough that the background of a room knows something has changed even if it can't name what. I shifted myself slightly, so that the angle between us was the angle of 2 people who have been talking long enough to stop being entirely formal about it, but not long enough to have relaxed into carelessness. The calibration between those 2 states is exact, and it comes from knowing what genuine ease looks like and being honest enough about it, that the approximation is close to the real thing. "I want to show you something," I said. She waited. "The south-facing observation windows at this end of the hall," I said, "show the transit lanes from an angle where you can see all 7 simultaneously. The geometry only works for about 8 minutes at this point in the station's orbit. I found it by accident on my 3rd night." She understood immediately. We moved along the window wall, not hurriedly, not with the quality of people executing a plan, but with the quality of people who have been standing in one place and have decided together to find something more interesting to look at. This is a common and unremarkable behavior at a reception. It reads as nothing. It is two people choosing a better view. We walked the length of the observation windows until we were at the south-facing end, where the transit lanes were visible at the precise angle I described. All 7, stacked vertically against the star field in their 7 different colors, blue and amber and white, and 3 shades of green, and one that was almost ultraviolet if you looked at it sideways without quite looking at it directly. I watched Sarah look at it. Her face, for a moment, did something that 11 days had not left room for. The managed composure opened, slightly, the way a door opens when the pressure differential on either side of it equalizes. Not dramatically, not with any announcement or performance. Just, the weight was elsewhere for a moment, and the person underneath the weight had room to look at 7 stacked transit lanes and find them genuinely beautiful. The silver eyes were on the ultraviolet lane, which was empty, which gave it a clarity that the occupied lanes didn't have, the clean, specific clarity of an unoccupied thing waiting to be used. "I didn't know this was here," she said. "Most people don't stop long enough." She watched the transit lanes. A ship moved along the amber one, slow transit bulk cargo, its progress patient and steady. 2 smaller vessels on the outermost green, moving in the same direction, giving each other the appropriate separation. The ultraviolet lane waited, clear and precise. "He's completed the second sweep," she said. Her voice had gone a different quality, not flat but lighter, like a floor after a heavy piece of furniture has been moved off it. "We're past the log close." "All right." She didn't move. She kept looking at the transit lanes. The primary moon through the south-facing windows was visible at an angle that showed the terminator line, the precise border between the lit and the unlit side, in a way the other windows didn't allow. It was a clean line, a clear delineation, things either in the light or not, with nothing ambiguous about the boundary. "I told you I would explain," she said. "You don't have to." "I told you I would." I waited. "I am not a civilian attaché," she said. She was looking at the transit lanes, not at me, and her voice had the quality of someone choosing words that are both accurate and safe for the space they're being said in, the formal language of a person who has spent 11 days saying nothing at all out loud about what they are actually doing. The document case, the scheduling access, the administration floor, those are a civilian cover. I am an emissary of the Velon secondary house. I've been on this station for 11 days because the meeting I came to facilitate required 11 days of groundwork that no one in the original timeline had accounted for, and the groundwork had to be invisible. And invisible groundwork is always done by a single person, because the moment it involves 2 people it begins to be visible. "The man at the bar," I said, "Velon faction." "The opposing faction. Yes. We are not at formal conflict. It is a succession matter, and succession matters at this level are managed through documentation and positioning rather than through any action that would be visible as conflict. But if he had logged me tonight as an unaccompanied emissary, my civilian cover would have come under question. My access to the administration offices would have been flagged, and 11 days of work would have become significantly harder to use tomorrow. "What's tomorrow?" "A meeting at 800, 4 parties in the same room for the first time." A pause. "If it holds together, there will be a settlement document." "Will it hold together?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I have accounted for the variables." "All of them?" "The ones that can be accounted for." She looked at the transit lanes. "The ones that couldn't be accounted for, I've been living with." I understood this. It is the thing that doesn't make it into any official accounting, the mass of what cannot be planned for and must simply be carried silently alongside the accountable work by the person responsible for the outcome. The invisible load, the weight with no column in any report, no line item in any project document, no official record of having been carried. You are the person who holds this. The holding is understood to be part of the work. The cost of the holding is not. I had watched this my whole life. My mother with the water allocation. The lead assessors on every site I'd worked, the ones who were actually leading rather than occupying the leadership role. The coordinator on the Velsing secondary site 2 years ago, who had managed a failing cultivation program back to viability over 14 months, and who, when the program posted its first positive yield projection, was congratulated by the project manager for the team's good work, with no other specification. I had never been in a position to change any of it, but I could be present to it. I could acknowledge it without requiring it to be smaller or more manageable than it was. I could be the one person in the room who was just there, without an agenda about it. You did the work, I said. Yes. For 11 days on your own. Yes. And it's going to hold together tomorrow. Yes. Then that's real, I said. Whatever anyone else accounts for or doesn't account for about how it happened, you did it and it's real. She turned her head and looked at me. The silver eyes, the mineral precision of them, and behind the precision something that was reading me with a different instrument than the one she'd used at the bar when she was making a calculation under pressure. This was not a pressure calculation. This was something quieter and more specific. People don't often say that, she said. Then they should say it more. The reception around us was thinning. The Velsing importers had wound down their conversation with Oren Kell and were drifting toward the food station, their manner indicating that the evening's business was settled and the evening's eating could now proceed. Sala, the freight coordinator, was still deep in her conversation in the way that good conversations run long, both of them forward-leaning, both of them apparently surprised to have found something interesting. The Velon faction operative had closed his handheld and pocketed it, and his posture had shifted to the posture of a person whose work was concluded, standing now as an attendee rather than as a cataloger. He would leave soon. He's finishing, Sarath said. I see him. In a few minutes, you won't need to stand here anymore. I'm not in a hurry. She looked at the transit lanes again. The 7-lane vertical stack had begun to resolve back into the more typical scattered arrangement as the station's orbit moved past the geometric alignment point. The blue lane was drifting downward relative to the amber, and the outermost green was pulling left. In a few more minutes, the arrangement would look like any other view of any other transit corridor, unremarkable, unrepeatable for another 19 days. The 3 moons, visible through the south-facing windows, were pulling apart, the primary moving ahead, the smaller 2 beginning their individual arcs, each doing its own particular thing in the gravitational presence of the others, influenced but not absorbed, maintaining their own paths. I chose you, Sarath said carefully. The tone of someone thinking aloud who has decided that aloud is where this thought should be. I looked across the room, and I chose you, because I calculated that you were the kind of person who could do this, without making it into more than it was. And you did not make it into more than it was. A pause. Which means I also read you correctly, which is more satisfying than it should be, given that reading people correctly is a basic requirement of my work. Does it happen that the calculation is wrong? Occasionally. Under pressure with incomplete information on a compressed timeline. She held her drink. The first time I'd noticed she was holding one, and I realized the attendant must have come past while my attention was on the transit lanes, and she had taken a glass without drawing attention to the taking of it, which was, I thought, entirely consistent with everything else I'd observed about her. The margin is never comfortable. The margin held tonight. Because of you, she said. I didn't know how to answer that in a way that wasn't either too large or too small, so I let it stand. Some things are better said and received without a response, Because a response moves the moment from the register of acknowledgement into the register of management, and this moment wanted only to be acknowledged. She set down her glass on the ledge beside the south-facing window. The Velon faction operative, I noticed in my peripheral vision, was moving toward the door with the manner of a concluded task. His departure was unhurried, precise, exactly on the schedule of someone who came to do something and did it and is now going. Whatever he had logged or not logged tonight was done. "I should let you go," Sareth said. "You've been standing at this reception longer than you wanted to." "I was watching the moons." "You were watching the room," she said. "I saw you when I arrived." "You'd been watching the room for 40 minutes before I appeared." "I watch rooms," I said. "It's the same skill as watching fields. You're looking for what it's actually doing, not what it appears to be doing." She looked at me. The calculation quality had resolved into something different, not warmer, exactly, but more specific. The way a field reads when you know what you're looking at. "Tail Morrow," she said. "Agricultural systems, works with what's actually there." "Most of it," I said. "May I find you," she said carefully, in the tone of someone making a request that is not a small request even if it sounds like one, "after the meeting tomorrow, if it holds together. I'll be in the South Wing lab until noon, after that the commissary." She nodded, the manner of someone noting something in the only memory system she trusted fully, which was her own. "All right." "Good luck tomorrow," I said, "with the meeting." "Thank you." She looked at the south-facing window, where the transit lanes had fully resolved into their ordinary arrangement, unremarkable now. The ultraviolet lane was empty still. And for tonight. "The margin held," I said. "It did," she said, "largely because of you." I let it stand. We parted without ceremony. She moved toward the inner end of the reception with the same composed purpose I'd read in the corridor all week, the deep gray making itself invisible again, the pinned hair doing its last work, the weight settling back onto her shoulders with the practiced ease of something she had been carrying for so long that the carrying felt like standing. I watched her go until the room absorbed her, and then I turned back to the observation window. The transit lanes. The 3 moons separated now into their individual arcs, each doing its own thing, each influenced by the others without being owned by them. The primary largest and brightest and ahead. The smaller 2 behind and slightly different from each other, each with its own trajectory, each going somewhere that was its own somewhere. I finished my glass and set it on the attendant's tray as he passed, and walked out through the side corridor, the one lined with cooling equipment that hummed at the frequency you felt in your back molars, and out to the station's exterior terrace. The terrace was narrow, filtered air, temperature managed, a bench at the midpoint that someone had installed facing the exterior viewport. The viewport showed the transit lanes directly, without the reception hall's reflections and refractions, clear and unmediated. I sat on the bench. The terrace was one of those spaces that exists on stations because the architects understood, at some level, that people need somewhere to be that is not inside the station's active life. It ran the full length of the outer hull, narrow enough that 2 people passing would have to angle, and the bench was positioned so that you could sit with your back to the hull and your face to the lanes without any of the station's internal geometry in your peripheral vision. Just the lanes, the ships on them, the star field behind all of it. I thought about Sareth. Not about the reception or the operative or the 40 minutes. Those were the surface of it, the what rather than the underneath. I thought about the underneath. About what it cost to do what she had done for 11 days. To carry every piece of invisible work, to make every calculation under pressure with incomplete information, to appear in every room as the person who had things in hand, while the weight of the having things in hand was borne entirely by the interior of you. Visible to no one. Acknowledged by no one, because the acknowledgement was not built into the structure of the work. I thought about the breath she had let out when I said yes. The particular texture of it, not relief at a problem solved, not relaxation after a difficulty passed, but something older than either. The breath of a person who has been doing something very large and very alone, and who has, for one moment, been seen doing it, and not required to minimize the largeness, or explain the aloneness, or manage the other person's reaction to either. I had not done anything remarkable. I had stood at her shoulder for 40 minutes and talked about moons and mineral soil chemistry, and had not asked her for anything or required anything from the exchange. And she had looked at the 7 stacked transit lanes and found them beautiful for a moment. That had been something, not nothing, something real. Invisible labor. The weight of carrying what no one else carries, of knowing what needs knowing and doing what needs doing, and the accumulated cost of all of it measured not in any official record, but in the depth of a single breath of relief at one person saying yes without asking why. I stayed on the bench longer than I had expected to. The terrace filtered the station's noise down to almost nothing, a faint vibration in the hull behind me, the low-frequency presence of the cooling systems. I stayed until the transit lanes shifted position as the station's orbit moved them, and the configuration I had been watching became a different configuration, and that one became another. Then I went to bed. The soil lab in the morning, the southeastern quadrant results, and the question of what the complication actually wanted to be when someone gave it room to be what it was. The meeting at 800 the following morning produced 4 parties in a room, and by noon, a settlement document. I know this because Sarah found me in the commissary at 12:14. She sat down across from me with a cup of something dark and sat with it for a moment without speaking, looking at the surface of it. She looked different. The same face, the same composed quality, the same practical precision in the hair and the clothing. But the weight that had been in her shoulders for 11 days was not there in the same way. Not gone. I didn't think it was gone. I thought the work had simply reached a point where it was no longer required to be carried in the same way, but distributed differently, like soil after rain, settled into a new configuration. It held together, she said. Good. All 4 parties. The settlement document is in its 3rd draft and will be signed before the end of the station day. Good, I said again. She looked at the cup, then at the table, then at the small round window in the commissary wall, through which the transit lanes were visible at an angle that showed only 3 of the 7 and showed them ordinarily, without geometric elegance. She looked at them for a moment anyway. I have 3 days before my transport leaves, she said. I find I would like to spend some portion of them not carrying anything. I considered this. The soil in the southeastern quadrant, the lateral ferrous bands, the yield profile that suggested something no previous assessor had thought to look for. The question not of how to make the soil conform, but of what the soil, given the chance, would choose to become. There's a botanical level in the station's lower habitation ring, I said. Most people don't know about it. The cultivated section has some soil chemistry I've been meaning to look at since my 3rd week volcanic origin base brought up from the planet for the growing medium, which is unusual and probably interesting. The afternoon light through the skylights is good. It's quiet. She looked at me across the commissary table. The silver eyes. The assessing quality that was, in the daytime and without the urgency of the previous evening, less like a room being catalogued, and more like a conversation being genuinely had. Are you offering to show me? She said. Yes. Without asking what I need it for. You said you want 3 days of not carrying anything, I said. The botanical level is quiet. The soil is interesting. I know where the good light comes in. She was quiet, not the managed quiet of the reception, where quiet was strategic and conserved. A different quality entirely, the quiet of someone who has set something down and is finding out what it feels like to have their hands empty, and is finding out that it feels like something they'd forgotten about themselves. The margin held last night, she said, because you agreed without asking why. I thought we'd covered that. We had. She held the cup with both hands. I am saying it again because I want to be clear that I understand what it meant, not strategically, personally. She looked at the commissary window, the ordinary 3-lane view. I have been in rooms for 11 days in which everyone who spoke to me needed something from the exchange, and the exchange was therefore a management problem rather than a conversation. You agreed without needing anything from the agreeing. That is, she stopped. Started again. That is not common. No, I said, I don't suppose it is. I would like, she said carefully, to spend 3 days in the company of someone who does that. If the offer is genuine. It's genuine. The botanical level, she said. This afternoon, if you like. I need to finish the morning's soil reports and I'll be done by 2. She nodded, the same noting in the reliable memory manner as the previous night. 2 o'clock. The botanical level entrance, lower habitation ring, east corridor. East corridor, I confirmed. She picked up her cup and held it and didn't drink from it immediately, just held it. I had the impression that this, the holding of a cup at a commissary table without an agenda, without a task requiring completion on either side of the exchange, was something she was reacquainting herself with. The simple fact of being somewhere without the somewhere requiring something of you. What will the soil tell you, she asked, in the botanical level? Probably that it's been grown in wrong for a while and would prefer something different, I said. Volcanic origin medium needs different management than standard cultivation soil. More mineral cycling, less nutrient supplementation. If they've been running standard protocols on it, the plants are probably doing worse than they should be. And you'll recommend something different. I'll find out what it actually wants first, I said, then recommend. She looked at me. The look that was past evaluation and into something more particular, more individual, the look that was about me specifically rather than about what I could do for the calculation. I had had that look from very few people in my life, and I recognized it the way I recognized an unusual mineral strata in a core sample, with a tension and a kind of quiet that made room for what it meant. Tale Morrow, she said, agricultural systems. At your service, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The managed quiet was gone entirely now. This was the quiet of someone who had set something down and was looking at their hands and finding them lighter than expected, and who was deciding what to do with the lightness. 3 days, she said. 3 days, I said. She set down the cup, finally, and looked at the commissary window again. The ordinary 3-lane view, no geometric elegance, just transit lanes doing their ordinary work. And something in her face did the same thing it had done at the south-facing window the previous night, when the weight was elsewhere for a moment, and the person underneath the weight had room to look at something and find it good. All right, she said. We met at the botanical level entrance at 2 o'clock. The east corridor of the lower habitation ring was quieter than the rest of the station, the lighting lower and more diffused, the foot traffic absent except for maintenance personnel moving through with the self-contained efficiency of people attending to the corridor as a system rather than as a space. Sareth was there before me, standing at the entrance panel with her document case gone, her hands free, wearing something that was not the deep invisible gray of the previous night, but a plain practical blue that had the quality of someone's actual clothing rather than someone's professional covering. I noted this without commenting on it. The blue was real in a way the gray had not been. The botanical level occupied a section of the lower habitation ring that had been built into the original station design as a cultivation research space, and long since handed off to a maintenance contract that serviced it adequately without particular attention. 2 large greenhouse corridors, temperature regulated to different profiles, and between them a central propagation room with skylights. Real skylights, directly to the exterior viewport system, not simulated daylight but actual filtered starlight that, at this point in the station's day cycle, included the reflected light from Velkern primary, and produced a warm and slightly unusual illumination that fell across the growing tables at an angle no standard lab light would replicate. I showed her the volcanic origin growing medium first. The mineral composition ran through a basic field analysis and came back showing exactly what I had expected. Too long exposure to standard cultivation protocols had depleted the volcanic medium's native mineral cycling in a way that left the plants technically nourished but not optimally nourished, supported but not thriving. The difference between adequate and good, in the specific way that a lot of work produces adequate results, because no one has thought to ask what good would look like for this particular substrate. "What would you plant?" Sarah asked. She was standing at my shoulder, looking at the analysis readout with genuine attention. "Something that benefits from the volcanic mineral density rather than requiring the standard profile." I thought about the southeastern quadrant results. There's a legume variety the Velsine have been developing for high mineral environments. It would probably do well here. The protein yield would be significant, and the medium would benefit from the legume. How? The legume fixes atmospheric compounds that replenish what the standard protocol depleted. They would be good for each other. I looked at the growing table. Neither of them is being used correctly as things are. She was quiet. I had the impression the conversation was about more than soil, and I did not make it about more than soil, because the soil was also genuinely interesting, and because some things are better said in the language of adjacent things rather than directly, and because she had asked about the soil and deserved an honest answer about the soil. The afternoon light in the propagation room changed as we worked. Velkern primary moved in its relation to the skylights, and the illumination shifted from the warm, direct quality of the early afternoon to something longer and more lateral, the light coming in at the angle that makes everything it touches look more itself than it usually looks. The growing tables, the propagation frames. Sarah's face turned toward one of the larger plants, her expression carrying the specific quality of quiet that belongs to someone who has set something down and is discovering, in small increments, what the setting down allows them to find. We stayed 3 hours that first day. We talked about the volcanic medium and about the succession matter, and about the soil chemistry of the southern continent, and about what 3 moons do to a planet's geology over geological time, and about a dozen other things that were each interesting in their own register. We did not talk about the reception or the operative or the 40 minutes, because those were finished, and the present moment was its own thing. The second day she brought a question about the propagation room's temperature variance. She had looked it up the previous evening, which was entirely consistent with everything I'd learned about her, and we spent an hour working through the data together, her reading the variance charts and me reading the medium samples. The combination produced an analysis better than either of us would have done alone. I told her so. She looked at the analysis, then at me. "That is a useful combination," she said. "It is," I agreed. "I find I don't have many of them." I thought about the Velsine legume and the volcanic medium, each depleted by the wrong approach and each, given the right partner, able to be what it was and to thrive for it. "They take longer to find," I said. "But they're worth looking for." The third day she showed me something she had found on her own in the second greenhouse corridor, a narrow aisle behind the main cultivation rows where someone had, years ago, planted something not in any of the station's cultivation records. Tall, dark-leafed, adapted to low-light conditions, producing a small, dense fruit along its lower stems. The field analysis indicated nutrient density outside the compact's standard botanical catalogs. We spent 2 hours on it. At the end, we had a working hypothesis, a sample, and an agreement to write up the find together for the station's botanical registry. "You found it," I said. "The credit is yours." "You identified what it was," she said. "We write it together." The afternoon light on the third day came from an angle that reflected off the amber transit lane through the east-facing skylight and doubled both direct filtered starlight and its reflection, producing a brightness in the room that made the plants look, briefly, lit from inside. Sarah stood in it and looked at the plant we had found, and I stood beside her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "My transport leaves at 600 tomorrow." "I know. The settlement document was signed yesterday. The work is concluded." "Yes." She was quiet. The light in the room shifted as the amber transit lane moved in the station's orbit, and the doubled illumination resolved back into the ordinary single-source quality. The plant looked like a plant again, which was also good. "Till morrow," she said. "What do you do when the assessment is finished?" "Write the report," I said. "File it, go home." "And after that?" "Start the next one." I thought about it. The southeastern quadrant results are going to require a follow-up site visit in about 3 months. The Velsing need the data from a full growing cycle before they can make the cultivation decision. 3 months from now, she said. Approximately. She looked at the transit lanes through the east-facing skylight. The amber lane, the blue, the outermost green. The geometry was ordinary now. No alignment, no stack. Just 7 lanes doing their ordinary work in the way that ordinary things do their work, continuously and without ceremony, every day. "I will be back on Velkern in 3 months, she said, for the follow-up documentation on the settlement. I looked at her. "This is a fact," she said, "not a request. I am telling you a fact." "I understand the distinction," I said. The corner of her mouth moved. The same movement from the reception, the not-quite smile that lived near one. 3 days of it now, and I had learned to read the specific texture of it, not amusement, not relief, but something more specific than either. The expression of a person who has calculated correctly and found the outcome to be precisely what they had hoped it would be, and who has not quite decided yet whether to acknowledge the satisfaction. "Good," she said. And that was the beginning of it, not the whispered request at the reception, though that was where it started, but this. The commissary table at 12:14 and the dark cup and the 3 days and the botanical level and its volcanic soil and the good afternoon light and the doubled illumination of the third day and the transit lanes through the east-facing skylight doing their ordinary continuous unremarkable work, and the particular quality of 2 people who have decided, without performing the decision, to spend some time working with what was actually there. I had agreed without asking why. She had chosen without requiring permission for the choosing. The margin had held. And the work we would do in the months after, in the southeastern quadrant, in the botanical level's second greenhouse corridor, in the reports written together for registries that had no category for what we were doing and would not have known how to file it, was not nothing. It was, as it turned out, the beginning of something that had no official record and required none, that was real regardless of what anyone accounted for, and that was exactly as complicated and exactly as worth it as the thing underneath the complication tends to be when you stop trying to correct it to match what you know and start asking what it actually wants to become.